So when you want to mesh a Hybrido-sim, you want to be aware of a few things. First of all, create your Hybrido mesh VDB rather than the standard mesh. And unlike the other meshes, you don't really need to go to the child object here because all the settings are going to be here. But you can add multiple domains to the same mesh. Up top, we have, first of all, we could just build this and see what we get. Typically, you want to start tweaking the polygon size, and probably the first thing I will do, all jokes aside, is change this hideous purple color to something that reminds me of water at least. I don't know really, next limit, come on, purple water? Polygon size, well, the better underlying sim you have, the better auto polygon size and particle radius are going to be for you. But obviously in the low res case, you might want to turn this off and start shaving off some numbers. It's good to be aware of how the auto values work and when it comes to particle radius. So if you start trimming down your polygon size in order to get sharper details to up your poly count, in this case I went up about 200,000, you probably want to be aware that your particle radius is going to be automatically set the same as your polygon size. And honestly, I don't think that works really well, especially when you're low res. So I want to beef this up now. So I want to take it up to a little blobbier. To start, because otherwise you can start to get dimples and holes. And then I will kind of sort the rest with filters. Filters work pretty much the same as we have already seen, if you've been looking at my crash course, for example. But let's take a look. We have the standard volume filters, dilate, erode, and smooth, which is pretty much no settings. We have splash thinning, which works by default with the Hybrido because the neighbor channel is simulated on the domain. So splash thinning, let us set up real quick a bound. So we get a bit of the action and a bit of the core fluid, and then just mesh interactive. So splash thinning, we'll look at the mesh and try to distinguish the areas that are kind of involved in the action and thin those out by this value. So the higher this value, the more it thins them out. And honestly, this isn't typically a splash, it's more like a wake. So maybe it's not even the correct thing to do, but you could see kind of a eroding effect here. And the threshold, pretty much the higher it goes, the stricter the particles need to be a part of, a splash to be considered by this. So the higher, the less smoothing pretty much, and the lower, then you're going to start smoothing out the entire action. Same thing goes for core smoothing. If we just enable it, a lot is going to be smoothed. So you probably want to raise up the core threshold, because I think the default threshold is a little too low, because it starts to creep up into the wakes and details that you have. And then you have the smoothing steps, like how many times you actually want to run the smooth. So let's up the steps a bit, lower the steps and up the threshold. And you can go on like that. So that would be a good way together with the global filters, which is pretty much the same as usual. You can go tension or relaxation, and you find a nice value, and then you increase the steps as you need to start to iron out these details. Typically, as far as I'm concerned, some of this type of detail is not too bad. You just want to be as close as possible to the particle sim and thin out your splashes, because eventually you're going to want to repeat the mesh, which I'm going to show you, and then probably in a case like this add some kind of a displacement, and then those details are not going to be too distinguishable anymore. Speaking of which, what really sets, the Hybrido mesh apart is a few things. So first of all, boundaries. We turn off interactive and we turn off bounded and just mesh again. We know that we have, like a cube of water, pretty much, our entire domain. But if we set it to open boundaries, now our domain gizmo is going to start to come into play. If you look from the top view, you can see the gizmo is slightly smaller than the area of the domain, and I'm going to set it roughly above the bottom here, and we can see when we mesh again with open boundaries, anything outside of the gizmo from the top and anything below the gizmo, if you look from the side, is going to be cut out from the mesh. And this is great when you want to do something like a boat traveling across a patch of ocean, because you don't want those extrusions at the bottom, because that's just going to cause issues with refracting, and eventually you're just going to somehow, either in your DCC or here in Realflow, you want to extend the ocean plane and you want to blend that together. So this is what we want. That's open boundaries, and then you have extension, which allows you to, if you go down to repeat, you have 3 by 3 by 3 by 3, including the center one. If you zoom out now, you can see that I have a preview grid here, and if I just build, this is what I'm going to get. So it creates a pretty much just an extension mesh, and the default is to set the sea level to auto. You can see here, you actually see my patch pretty visibly here because it has some micro details. So in here I have 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 by 7, so a grid of 42 times bigger than my single area. Let's just get rid of all of these except for one. So it's extending, but it's only subdividing as much as it necessarily have to in order to create some detail. So that's repetition, or extension, I mean. You can choose to set sea level manually if you need to. I've never had the need to do that, but in case these don't line up the way you expect them to, you could go in and start to tweak this yourself by unchecking this. You can also go uncoupled, which will give you the extension as a separate object in case you need to maybe extract that into its own render layer or something like that. Now, the hard truth is, of course, that, I mean, you can see, if we give ourselves a repetition in U as well, you can see that obviously I would have needed to simulate a lot bigger tank than this, because there's ripples traveling to the edge of the domain. You're not going to get away from that with repetition. There is a fall off, which we can set to, let's say, 1 meter, and you're going to see that this is now going to start to blend together. But in reality, you have to have a large enough container so that it actually starts to dissipate before it reaches the edges, because this fall off actually comes with its own set of issues if you push it too hard. So I usually don't have too much of a fall off, and then I try to get rid of any visible transition or artifact with the displacement in the end, and probably we need to smooth this out a bit more. But it's just good to be aware of these tools and where they are. And the next thing obviously is displacement. So you can go about this in a few ways. Displacement, as I'm sure you're all aware, is, you know, using a texture or a procedural texture to displace an object at render time. So we could take something like this very sparse plane, or this example I have here, where I just take one plane in Maya and I assign an animated texture, which could come from, you know, a plugin, or it could come from Realflow, and I just displace it with this. And this is just a plane with a couple of subdivs really, and I just animated this texture instead of to create a semi-believable ocean, if you will. So that's displacement, and we can in several ways we can output displacement from RealWave and Realflow. RealWave is a household tool that comes with Realflow. It's just a deformer surface with some wave equations that you can output from. You can also output displacement on the domain itself. We want to be aware of a few things then. You can set your domain to calculate displacement under the Ocean Statistical Spectrum tab. Ocean Statistical Spectrum is one of many kind of wave equations. If you look out there, there are tons of white papers, different studios do it in different ways. So if you need something super specific, then maybe this is not for you, but it's one of the most common ones that kind of pop up. And it's, I mean, it's reasonably good, and you could always add your own resolution on top in the end. I want to set this to calculate always because I did not have this enabled when I simmed. And then you can do one or two things. Go to the mesh, go down to shader and set it to displacement. And that's going to try to approximate whatever info is set on the domain in the Ocean Statistical Spectrum. And it's going to try to preview that as a displacement shader. So now we can try to arrive at something that we like in terms of surface detail. And you can already see that, first of all, this is not really on par with OpenGL displacement previews that are out there, like in Houdini, for example. It still gives you an idea of what you're going to be looking at. So we'll do this for stutters. And you could maybe play around with the auto dimension, turning that off, and try to find a decent value that might be better for you. And you might want to try setting the depth manually. Play a bit with the vertical scale. But in all honesty, I find that it's a little hard to kind of arrive at where you want to be with this tool, even though, you get pretty fast feedback and everything. So what I tend to do a lot of the time, see, now we're getting a little closer now that we gave it some wind speed. But what I tend to do is, because the Ocean Statistical Spectrum is also available on Realwave, so you can create a Realwave and you try to make it roughly the same size as your sim. And then if I just turn off my domains, I'm not even going to load cache from it. I'm not going to build mesh. I'm not going to show mesh. I'm not going to show my collider. And then I can just reset this and give Realwave, if you right click on it, a wave, and voila, Ocean Statistical Spectrum, and reset. You have to reset constantly with this one. And then you can start to see more, fair representation of what you're going to get. So I can start increasing my quality here. And I can also, if you need to, you can come into Realwave Object and lower the poly size. But in all honesty, you're not going to be exporting the mesh itself, but if you need to get a better representation, because what we're going to take out of this is either texture or just settings for our domain, something like that, and depth. And you constantly need to refresh or reset. Let's try lowering dimension. That makes a huge effect, and it's a pretty small container that we have after all. I don't want to run in command line here. I'm not gonna wait for the whole thing and play it back. I just want to see kind of what the movement looks like, even though I might be kidding myself not looking at it real time. And then a bit of wind speed, and you can play with the direction if you want to kind of try to make it go in any specific direction. It's really just trial and error. And then you can also, wind alignment is a really powerful feature. Like the more you up this, the less organic it looks. So it can become really like a sine wave, almost like a lab condition wave. But I like to keep it to default. Choppiness, I usually put that at 0.9 to get the highest peaks are going to be as sharp as possible. And you don't want to go a lot higher than that, because then you might start inverting your peaks. All in all, I'm going to go with this, and I'm going to just do a screen dump and use this as a cheat sheet. So I'm just pulling it to the side. And then I'm pretty much just going to delete my Realwave, because I'm not going to use it in this case. I could use it if I just wanted a displacement texture. It's really useful for that. You can go down to displacement texture, and you see here that by default it's outputting a Realwave cache and a surface deformation, which you can import as a texture inside of your 3D app with the Realflow Connect. But the sweet thing is, setting a displacement texture, you can even get an EXR, a 32-bit float vector displacement, which is really capable. The reason I want to calculate this on the domain, if we turn on our domain and our mesh again, and just make sure that we update the cache and go to a frame, look at the domain and look at the mesh with displacement. And you can then see that there's a mismatch here. And that mismatch is going to be an issue if you need to sim secondaries like foam or splash or anything like that, especially foam that kind of rests on top of the surface. And then so you displace this surface inside of Maya, for example, and then your particles are going to be off. But the beauty is that if I, instead of using Realwave, I use the domain settings. So I have my little cheat sheet here. I'm going to put the same depth that I arrived at. The dimension that I had was about 300. The vertical scale needs to come down a lot. Vertical scale, I had 0.006, but vertical scale is one of those attributes that I think does not correlate that well between these two. But otherwise, ocean statistical spectrum is really pretty universal, like when you look at it in Realwave, when you look at it in Hybrido. All in all, what I'm getting at is, once I've set this up, I want to run it through Hybrido. So I can run the sim again and make sure under Hybrido, now that we're calculating displacement always, I can get a displacement texture, and then I can displace the texture just as I could have with the Realwave displacement texture. But the difference is there's going to be a distance field generated as well. So inside of my domain, inside of the data that comes out of the domain, not only the particles, which are still going to be, with the flat surface, but there's going to be a distance field. So when I've run my foam and everything, I can go to Hybrido and displace the foam using the displacement that has been calculated in the Hybrido domain. So that can be pretty useful. That being said, when it comes to the sim mesh itself, especially, and sometimes even the repetition, sometimes I don't want to go the displacement texture route, because it can be pretty, it can create glitches for you. In this scene, it would probably be fine, but let's say you have a splash scene and, like a crown splash is spreading out, and you don't really want to add displacement on those tiny tendrils of liquid, because you might start to get pretty weird errors. So what you might want to do is start masking out, so the areas of the mesh that are part of the splash, for example, or at a certain height or a certain vorticity, you don't want those to have the displacement. That can be a little hard to set up. So honestly, a lot of times when I want to do displacement in here, I will, instead of using the shader on the mesh, I will go up and say use displacement. And now the definition displacement becomes a little vague, actually, because we're actually not using displacement anymore in its traditional sense of displacing the mesh at render time, a low-res mesh per bucket with a texture. We're actually taking that information that is calculated on the domain and we're baking it into the mesh. So I'm going to sim, and it's going to take a while the first time, and I'll be back. And it took a few minutes, and it's way too heavy. It's 62 million faces or polygons, and it's still pretty impressive, I think, that it can create that amount of detail and still remain stable in a few minutes. But this is obviously not what we want. It kind of looks great, the detail. There's a lot of detail in there, and you also see that all the issues that we had with the transition and everything taken care of. But we obviously need to start lowering this down. And the reason it becomes so huge the first time is the auto edge length feature. You can almost by default just set that to another value, but I wanted to show you. It takes whatever quality you have set, and it tries to estimate somehow how much, here's the quality, and it tries to estimate how much it needs to subdivide each edge in order to maintain the detail it has in the displacement. So let's just uncheck this and try the default of 0.1. It's probably going to be too high, but we're going to get a significantly lighter mesh, probably with slightly less details. But yeah, it finished in 10 seconds, or 9 actually, and it's way too coarse, so we need to lower the edge length. Let's cut it in half and see if that takes us to roughly double, and then we need to start go even deeper down, 0.025, and build. So now obviously one of the reasons it becomes so huge is that we're not only doing high-res mesh in the area where the sim was, like it was before, where the extension areas were pretty sparse in terms of topology. Now we have to add all of that topology detail to the repetitions as well. So I think I could live with something like 3 million polygons. That should be pretty fine. And like I said, one of the main reasons the times that I use this feature, baking the displacement into the mesh rather than outputting it as a texture, is when I want to blend so that the displacement doesn't affect, the areas where my object just traveled through, which should, honestly, like the velocities in here should kind of win over the displacement right now, so it should kind of dissipate slowly. If we look at another example I did, which should be a little more visual for this. So it's just like a boat traveling across an ocean plane. And you can see that in the wake of the boat, pretty much this is just a scale up of the current scene that we have. I animated the boat pretty much the same way that we did with the emitter in A, and just, you know, sign expressions. And it's a slightly larger pool. I think I ended up at it's still not a production shot by any means, but, you know, like 7 million particles or something like that. And then once I meshed this with one repetition in each direction, I arrived at something like 19 million polygons, I think. But it looks, you know, pretty good. Obviously it needs foam, but so far so good. But the sweet thing here, like, I tried to actually put out the displacement as a texture, but it gave me a lot of issues when it displaced in the areas where there were splashes. And I could kind of separate it based on, you know, like a height ramp inside of Maya, but it was really hard to get a smooth transition. And there's a lot of tools inside of Realflow in order to get this effect that where there's currently high velocity, it should be smooth, and then after some time when the velocity dissipates, then the displacement comes back into play in those areas. And that's going to be like this: the height attenuation, the speed attenuation, the splash attenuation, and the vorticity attenuation. Height attenuation would be your go-to, I guess, if you have, you know, like a big crown splash or something like that. So you get a nice gradient like from the base of the fluid and into the upper areas. I think speed attenuation is something we could play with here. Splash attenuation is just much like the splash thinning filter. It's going to pull from the threshold that the particles, the neighbor information that is baked into the particles, and then we have splash attenuation factor just as a multiplier. And then vorticity attenuation, haven't really used it that much, but I imagine it could be pretty effectful. But that requires you to have computed under particle channels the vorticity, and I didn't do that in this case, but we could look at that in some later example maybe. So let's try them out. Let's set the bound. I think what we want to do just to save waiting time, obviously I cut out the waiting time, but for my own sanity, I guess, I want to turn off extension and just focus on the sim area. And I want to go back to bounded. I'll put it kind of around the, so we get kind of the wake behind the object, and also a bit of core fluid, because that's the transition that we kind of care about. And now I'll go back to Mesh Interactive, and let's see what we get. So let's do slightly bigger and slightly further back. So height attenuation, if you go to the use displacement and height attenuation, whatever piece of the mesh which is below this value is going to have full displacement, and whatever piece of the mesh which is above this value is going to have no displacement, and whatever is in between these two values is going to have, you know, a gradual fall off. But in my case, a lot of the liquid is in the range of like half a unit, so I'm not going to use this one. And then you can play with the attenuation factor to kind of take control of how harsh the fall off is going to be. So just play around with that if that's suiting to your scene. I think speed attenuation, we're going to play with that. If we look at the domain at any given frame, we can see in the stats that the velocity is between 0 and 12 in this frame. And it's not going to be exactly those values, but it's a good starting point. If we just enable it first of all, these values should not be good enough. But just like we did with the display section, we can start to kind of clamp this down. So remember, I had 10 before, and I kind of went to 4 in speed max when I was looking at the velocity channel. You saw something happen in there. Might need to, because I don't anticipate that this velocity is very high. It's only like very few particles that are going to have a high velocity, like on the edges of some kind of wake or something like that. And then since this is pretty fast, we can just go before and after by unchecking the speed attenuation, and look, just take a look at the wake area here and see now that it acted, it kind of smoothed it out. And we can keep tweaking. And we can also, let's try it with 3, but use the speed attenuation factor. It's, you know, it's partly trial and error, but also I really want to encourage you to read thoroughly through the documentation on these, because there's a lot of things going on, because they need to normalize the velocities, because otherwise it becomes a little tricky to manage these things, and you need to be aware of what the different values are doing in order to find the right setting. I'm going to turn off bounded and see what this looks like across the domain here. And I think, yeah, I'm pretty happy about it. You see that it's kind of fading out around here. Let's try maybe playing around a bit with speed attenuation factor, see what the effect is. See if this creeps any closer or if it kind of blurs the line a bit. Yeah, it's a bit softer. I think it's kind of nice to have it a little harsher. It shouldn't be like a razor sharp line, but yeah, maybe something like this could be good in our case. You really need to play around with these values and get a feel for them and try it a few times. Let's try something else. Let's try splash attenuation, see what that does for us in this case. So just on and off, it's probably not going to be a huge difference. Yeah, some difference. And then you can kind of start scaling this. That really just smoothed the entire thing or took out the displacement of the entire thing. But like I said, it's a lot of trial and error, at least for me. I don't tend to get too scientific about these things, unless I really have to, and then you just have to deep dive into the docs. So let's go with speed attenuation and turn back our repetition, and then I'm just going to write out the sequence here. We know already that we will have issues over here. Let's just, you know, let's just ignore that. Let's just get this wrapped up. Go to extension, turn that back on. Probably shouldn't be meddling with these things while you have Mesh Interactive on, so I reserve myself for a potential crash here. Here we go. We managed. Yeah, I mean, obviously not the greatest scenario for using these features, since we are simming the mesh from the outer edge of the sim, and that's why, you know, in the real world, what this really comes down to is how much of a margin can you give yourself in the container so that you don't have a hard transition, or maybe you could kind of animate the camera or something like that to get away from it. So in my case, in the example with the boat, I was able to make the domain pretty big, but it took a while to sim. But, you know, it's usually not an issue. Realflow is pretty stable with these things, and in the end, the mesh doesn't tend to get too crazy, so you can usually get away with it in the end. And the further back you go, I mean, the more you need to see of the domain, the further back you're going to be, and that means probably you could save some resolution at least and stay fairly low. Yeah, I think that's really it for now. Let's just take a look at the entire sequence once it's done. So the sim is finished, and this is the result. And we can notice a few things. The first thing I notice is the water looks almost frozen, but it's not. If you look carefully on a patch, you see that there's rolling waves. And really, what happened here is I was a bit sloppy and setting it way too small in the scale. This is kind of looking now as if we're doing a wide shot, and this is a huge concrete letter that magically is running through the water. So it looks like the B is pretty huge and the other details are tiny, as if we were really zoomed out. So that we can fix. We can set, we can play with the speed of the displacement, or we can, I think we will also make sure there's a bit bigger details here, so it looks a little more correct in scale. If you ever could get a scene like this correct, seeming it's not really a realistic thing. The other thing is I'm kind of liking the motion that we have here quite a bit, actually. So I think I was just going to dismiss this as, you know, a first steps crash course into Hybrido, but I kind of want to see it without this issue, and yeah, I think I'm just gonna scale the domain out quite a bit and rerun the sim again, actually, and try to fix this. And just as a bonus step in this one, we can actually render this.
So I just wanted to show you the result real quick. What I did was I took the container domain and the water domain and just scaled those up by a factor of 2.5. So we now have 25 by 25 meters, same depth. It's looking a lot better in terms of, the artifacting. You can still see the border, but maybe we can add, a normal map or something when we render and get rid of that. We could go slightly higher, but I'm not going to push it for this example. Another thing you can see is that it's not quite, as pleasant to look at as it was before, and that's because I raised the particle count slightly, but I didn't raise it so that I got to a point where I had 2.5 the amount of particles that I had before. So maybe I can try to push it slightly more. I'm gonna have to see if I can squeeze the time in to run another sim before I record the last session where we do just a quick render setup. But that's the gist of it. I also just added default setting splash thinning, which you can see works pretty well. It's not very detailed, but you can see thin details kind of splashing up, which I think looks nice. I tried once with coarse smoothing. The default settings was way too brutally smooth and took out pretty much all of the details. So I brought it way up in the threshold and way down in the number of iterations. So I think like 32 steps and 0.6 or something in the threshold. It's still looking a little, like flat and smoothed, but I think that's an issue we can remedy with the lighting inside of Maya.